So apologies for the confusing page. I didn't realize how bad this looked until I've kind of come back to it. Anyway, what I'm going to do is just give you a quick introduction to the dispositional factors, which is the last part of the social influence topic. So for this to make sense in terms of the sequence of the topic, if you're doing the GCSE, you should have already covered part one, which is the key terms and concepts. So what conformity is, that kind of thing. You should have covered the situational factors. I posted 4 videos on that. You should have also covered Bickman, the study. Again, I've posted a video on that. Now, confusingly, I've already posted the Natcen video, but I never actually talked about the dispositional factors. So that is what we're going to do today. Just to give you a little bit of explanation and context for those, basically, they are the alternative explanation to your situational factors. So, as I've already said, situational is about what is going on around you, and dispositional is about what is going on inside you. There are 4 dispositional factors which kind of map onto the 4 situational factors that we already looked at, so you'll have 2 explanations for each of the social behaviours that this topic covers. So the first one of these dispositional factors is linked to conformity. So we looked at how a majority influence around you, that could be your situational factor, and that's going to make you potentially conform. The dispositional factor, which also links to conformity, is self-esteem. Self-esteem, I'm guessing, is something that you've heard of. It's quite a common phrase just in general conversation. It basically is a measure of how you feel and perceive yourself. Now, I can't actually share the assessment with you, but there are plenty online. So if you're interested in doing this personally, stop the video, go and have a look for one. There's loads around. If not, let's carry on. So basically, your self-esteem is how you think about yourself. There are essentially 2 versions. You can have low self-esteem or you can have high self-esteem. Low self-esteem is essentially a low opinion or low confidence in yourself, and a high self-esteem is high opinion of yourself. You do need a degree of self-esteem in order to enjoy your life. If you have really low self-esteem, that's going to cause a lot of problems for you. And one of those problems is you're going to conform very easily. So basically, the science behind this is one that does have a nature kind of basis to it, at least for what you need to know within the GCSE. In real life, it's a lot more nuanced, but for what you need to know is that there is a link between the size of your hippocampus and your self-esteem, and it's a positive correlation. What that means is, as your hippocampus is larger, your self-esteem is higher. They both increase together. So a strong and a healthy hippocampus is going to be correlating to a strong and a healthy, or high and healthy self-esteem. So I kind of gave away the answer to this question, but it would be worth pausing to think about why does that affect conformity. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to figure out why that is. If you remember when we looked at conformity originally, we looked at Solomon Asch's famous line experiment. It showed that when people are in a group, there's 3 or more others who've all given the same answer, puts quite a lot of social pressure for people to conform. But there were 2 different reasons that people conformed. The first was called normative conformity, and that was where people knew that the group were wrong, but they wanted to appear normal. They just didn't want to stand out. The other type of conformity was informational conformity, and that is the one that is more strongly affected by your self-esteem. Informational conformity is when you actually believe that the other people are right. If you have a really low self-esteem, you're going to have to put more confidence in other people than yourself. So you could put it onto a bit of a spectrum that looks something like this. When you have very low self-esteem, you will always conform to what others want because you don't have the confidence in yourself to do anything else. And that's essentially what you need to know about how self-esteem links to conformity. Hopefully that makes sense. So the second of the dispositional factors is locus of control. Now this is something that you probably have not heard of. It's quite well established within psychology, but locus of control sounds kind of worse than it is. Locus comes from the same root word as location, And so the way that I think about this is that it's the location of control for your life. Okay, and again, there are assessments that you can do where you can kind of check what your locus of control is. So essentially, locus of control is how much of the control you feel you have over your own life and how much of your life is controlled by things external to you. So you, again, a bit like self-esteem, you get two categories. You get internal locus of control, your life is controlled from inside you, and you get external locus of control, which is that the other factors in your life, the situation maybe, control you. So pretty straightforward concept. A few questions. This is a little bit different now. Obviously, these resources are written with the intent of being delivered in class. So I would have more of a discussion around it. You'll just have to put up with the questions. So these are good questions to ponder. You could take some time to think about how you would respond, and then what I'm going to do is basically give you the answer in like 2 seconds. So locus of control was first kind of proposed by Julian Rotter. It's quite an old theory, and basically what they found was that young people were more likely to have an external locus of control. Now that's not particularly surprising. Generally, when you are young, you do have less control over your life, and so no surprises there. But what he said was that can essentially make people become much more passive, and it can also make them much more likely to just blame everything on things that are out of their control, because generally things are out of their control, so they kind of don't take responsibility for their own actions. So that links to collective and crowd behavior, because if you don't think that you really can control it, you're used to your life being controlled by others, then when you get yourself into a crowd situation, you're very likely to go along with what everyone else is doing, because that's pretty much how you view your whole life. So this explains why when we look at riots, we look at that kind of large-scale antisocial behavior and stuff, it's generally young people getting involved in that. Locus of control kind of gives the justification for it. Once you get into kind of your middle-aged portion of your life, generally you do decide. You decide what you eat. You decide where you live, where you work. There's not really people telling you what to do, and so you could argue that makes it less likely then for you to just get swept along, because you're not used to having that happen to you. And that's really it. There's no neuropsychological link to this one. It is more of a social thing that changes as you age and develop. And that's pretty much all you need to know about locus of control. The third one that we're going to look at, dispositional factor, is the stages of moral development. And this was proposed by Lawrence Kohlberg. This is a theory that I particularly like, find it quite interesting because it links to a lot of different areas of life. If you look online, you will find some of Kohlberg's dilemmas, he called them, and that was the little scenarios that he used to test the stage of moral development people are in. If you want to have a go, stop the video and do it now, because once I've taught you the stages, you probably won't answer in the same way. So, the effect of morality on pro and antisocial behavior essentially recognizes the fact that each person has an individual moral compass, or conscience, sometimes it's known as. Kohlberg basically said that morality was our understanding of what is right and wrong, and he gave people scenarios to try and assess it. So one that I use in class, this is not one of Kohlberg's dilemmas, this is Mr. Barber's dilemma. Is it okay to kick a cat? And whenever I give this to a class, there's always a range. There are always some animal lovers in there who say it's never okay to kick a cat. And there are always some people who hate cats and just feel like, yes, cats should be kicked all the time. We don't even really need a reason. So that gives you an idea of how some people view a certain behavior as being completely acceptable and others quite the opposite. And that kind of links to another question, which is, well, where does this morality come from, and kind of who has it? So for example, does a newborn baby have any concept of what's right or wrong? I think it's very difficult to argue that they do. So clearly that's got to develop from somewhere. Does a child? And if so, what age? Does an animal have a moral concept? We assume that adults do, but again, where's that come from? What about AI? We can get into some pretty deep stuff here, which isn't really relevant, so we won't. Anyway, what Kohlberg did was he conducted a longitudinal study, and he basically followed the same people for 12 years and gave them moral dilemmas which were age appropriate for them. And what he discovered is that moral reasoning followed a pattern. So a little bit like Piaget's stages, this allowed him to develop his own theory called the stages of moral development. The way that I think of it is being a staircase like this. So there are 6 stages of moral development divided into 3 levels. So looking through those, if this is going to work, the first stage is about avoiding punishment. So the most basic reason for us to do or not do something is that we don't want nasty things to happen to us. We don't want to be punished. So we will not do the stuff that we will get punished for. At that point, you don't really have a concept of whether it's right or wrong. You just know you're going to get punished for it. The next stage is only a slight development from that. It is about getting rewards. Now, this first level you can't see because very inconveniently it is under my face. It's called the pre-conventional level, and Kohlberg said this was basically what you observed in fairly young children. So basically, we don't do stuff that we get punished for, and we do things that we get rewards for, and that's the most basic form of morality. This pre-conventional level is essentially selfish. It's all about, I don't want nasty things to happen, and I do want nice things to happen. So at this low level of moral development, people can be quite antisocial because they don't actually care about others. They only care about themselves, and they're only avoiding certain behaviors if they'll be punished for it. Thankfully, moral development doesn't usually stay at that stage. Although when Kohlberg gave his moral dilemmas to prisoners, he found that most of them were still in this low level. The next step, level 2, is the conventional, and that was because Kohlberg said the majority of people's moral reasoning happens at these levels. The first one is about getting approval from others. So at some point in our developmental journey, we realize, hey, it's helpful to my life if other people like me. And so we start caring about their approval. And so what that means is we start behaving in a way that gets us approval. And we want to think of ourselves as being a good person, or we want others to think of us as being good. The next level, stage 4, is about following the rules. So at this point, we kind of internalize the identity of a good person, and we can kind of abstract that into certain rules. So for example, good people don't steal, good people don't lie, those kinds of things. And so it becomes, rather than just wanting approval, we kind of abstractify that, and that becomes about rule following. So that was where Kohlberg said most people made most of their decisions. However, it didn't stop there. What he found was that as people aged, particularly as they went through higher levels of education, that they entered into a post-conventional way of moral thinking. So the 5th stage he called social contract and the law. So this is basically taking the rules of what makes you a good person and kind of moving it up to the next level and recognizing that there are certain obligations that we have to society, and those are usually put into law. So for example, I don't know, pirating videos or downloading them illegally from the internet or whatever, most people wouldn't say that that makes you a bad person. However, there is some understanding that it's not being fair on the wider society and it's illegal, and so most people don't do it. So that's kind of the 5th level. the pinnacle of moral development, according to Kohlberg, and this one's got a little bit of controversy about it because some psychologists argue that it doesn't actually exist, that it's just the other reasons masquerading as something more virtuous. The final one is called the universal ethical principle. And this is the idea that a person can reach a stage of moral development where they are 100% committed to an ethical rule or principle, and that kind of supersedes everything else. It's even more important than the law and than what society wants. A really good example of this is Desmond Doss. Now, if you've ever seen the film Hacksaw Ridge, you'll know who I'm talking about. This was a guy who was in America in the outbreak of the Second World War, and all of his friends signed up to the army, but he had a religious conviction that violence was wrong, and he'd made a personal commitment to God that he would never touch a weapon. And yet he wasn't a coward. He wanted to join the army and serve his country, so he agreed to join the military as a conscientious kind of objector, and that he would go in and he would serve as a medic, so he would still be there with everyone else. He just wouldn't touch a gun. The rest of his kind of battalion, I'm not really sure what the military terminology is, they all hated him. They thought he was a liability, that he was almost court-martialed from the military. He actually was very nearly put in prison for refusing to follow the order because he wouldn't even do the basic training with a rifle because of this universal ethical principle. And so he's a good example of somebody who stuck to his morals. I don't want to spoil the story, but I recommend that you find out about it, because it's quite an interesting and impressive story, and a really good example of what moral development looks like. So the implications of this are that people in pre-conventional level are more antisocial because they're motivated selfishly, and if they can get away with it, don't think they'll be punished. So you can get away with picking on somebody in the playground. You can get away with graffiti. You do it at night time, stuff like that. They don't really care about what's good for society, just what they can get away with. When people move on to the second and especially the third levels of moral development, they become much more pro-social because they genuinely begin to care about other people's experience of life and about society. And so the moral reasoning shifts from being egocentric. A few other researchers have kind of followed up his work and found that people in prisons, as I mentioned earlier, have lower levels of moral development. They've found that they've discovered which type of parenting styles are best for developing high levels of moral development. And there is another neuropsychological link here. Moral reasoning is a type of problem solving, and that means it's done in the frontal lobe, or your prefrontal cortex specifically. And so damage to that area of the brain will affect your moral reasoning. So there's a really good example of this in a man called Phineas Gage. Again, he's another one that you can look up. He was a very conscientious, hardworking, a good guy. Worked on a railroad. An accident caused an explosion which sent basically a steel spike through his head, destroying most of his prefrontal cortex, or large parts of it. He survived miraculously, went on to heal, he even returned to work, but his morals were basically shot. He became an awful person. No one wanted to work with him. He was aggressive. He would swear all the time because the part of his brain that was doing that moral reasoning was damaged beyond repair. And so prefrontal cortex linked to moral reasoning. And that's pretty much what you need to know about Kohlberg's work on moral development, that third dispositional factor. Final, fourth dispositional factor, authoritarian personality. This is a really interesting one. Again, there's an assessment that you can take to measure your personality in terms of how authoritarian it is. Authoritarian is linked to the word authority. This theory was proposed by a guy called Theodor Adorno, and this was kind of coming off the back of World War II. He was somebody a little bit like Milgram, who was interested in how the Nazis could commit the atrocities that they did. And rather than Milgram, who thought that it was a situational influence, Adorno thought that it was dispositional. He thought that the German people, or many of them, had a particular type of personality that made them more likely to behave this way. So he set about figuring out how to measure that, how to define it, and he called it authoritarian personality and measured it on his assessment on what he called the F scale, F standing for fascism. People with authoritarian personality look a bit like this. They have high levels of conformity in group situations. They're also highly obedient to people they view as being in authority over them. So they have quite a black and white view of you do what you're told. Don't know why that's messed up so much in the formatting, sorry. So they would never consider that the law might actually be at fault, or that the person in authority, it's just kind of a given, you just do what you're told. So they're blindly obedient and follow people without question. That also, unfortunately, means that people who they view as being below them are subject to that same expectation. So they're very prejudiced, discriminatory, and expect blind obedience from the people below them, and don't really have any qualms about treating them cruelly and forcing them to do what they think is right. So this links to obedience in the same way that Milgram's work did. So it's quite straightforward, really. Adorno basically said that if you've had an extremely strict upbringing where you've been expected to obey without question, and particularly if you've had a super strict dad who's maybe been absolutely harsh with you, that you kind of internalize that view and that becomes your personality. And what he found was that many people who on the Milgram study, those who had actually gone all the way and electrocuted the learner, actually they all scored really high on the F scale for authoritarian personality. So although Milgram looked at the authority figure as being the situation, Adorno did the other half of that and showed that, well, yeah, the authority figure makes a difference, but authority figures only really work on somebody who's got a bit of an authoritarian personality, or they certainly work best on those kinds of people. Again, that one doesn't have a neuropsychological link. That is just a purely kind of from the nurture side. So those are the 4 dispositional factors. Quick summary, as we've already said, there are some neuropsychological stuff. So hippocampus is linked to self-esteem, and also your damage to the prefrontal cortex can cause moral reasoning. So that is your dispositional factors, the second part of social influence. A couple of questions that you might want to consider, and this will kind of link us onto the evaluation, which we'll go on to now. So unlike many of the other theories, dispositional factors actually considers the influence of nature and nurture. So that's a strength, not a weakness that you would want to use. It's also a fairly holistic theory if you take dispositional factors as a whole. Each of the individual explanations might be reductionist, but because you're looking at 4 different explanations for people's behaviour, plus looking at nature and nurture, you could argue dispositional factors is a holistic idea. However, it is deterministic, because what you're saying is these dispositions that you have are going to cause you to behave in this way. So Adorno would measure your personality, and if you scored high on the F scale, he would say, right, so basically you would go and electrocute people in Milgram's study. So deterministic, you don't really kind of have a choice about it. Going on to the criticisms then, the evaluation, this is the final bit. I know the video's gone on quite a while, but there's a fair bit of detail in there that you need to know. Criticisms, essentially, It's all very focused on the personal disposition, and that means that it's quite hard to generalize. Now, you can't really avoid that. I feel like that's a little bit of a weak criticism, to be honest, but it is one that's given and accepted by the exam board. And then you've got some specific criticisms of the theories themselves, like the individual ones. So, for example, Kohlberg, all the participants in his longitudinal study were men. So you could definitely argue that there's a gender bias there, because we don't know if women follow the same stages of moral development. I mean, we do now because others have done it, but we didn't if we only look at Kohlberg. Also, locus of control, it's kind of put forward as though you have a locus of control for your whole life, you know, are you in charge or not, when actually other research indicates that it's a lot more nuanced. So some people have a locus of control that's internal in one area of their life and external in another part. So again, you can kind of criticize those individual theories, but on the whole, dispositional factors is pretty good. If you're going to go with the criticism, the main one is
that it's really deterministic. It's treating you like you don't really have any choice or freedom. You're just kind of a result of these different dispositions, when actually people's individual choice is really important. Our criminal justice system, for example, doesn't work unless people have freedom of choice. And theories like this, which are really deterministic, say that you don't have freedom of choice. So that's probably the main argument you want to make against this theory.
I know this is an abrupt transition, but while I was editing, I realized that the last section was awful. So I'm just going to redo it and you won't know. To sum it all up then, dispositional factors. The first one is your self-esteem. It's got a neurological basis where your hippocampus, the grey matter in your hippocampus, correlates more hippocampus, more self-esteem. High self-esteem is good, low self-esteem is bad, you'll have higher conformity. Second, locus of control. Internal is generally good. You control your life, you make better decisions. External can lead you into trouble because you just justify your actions based on what others are doing. Morality, 3 levels, 6 stages. Basically, once you're out of that first level, you become more pro-social. If you have a low level of moral development, you're going to be antisocial. That can be caused by damage to the prefrontal cortex. Final one, dispositional. Number 4 is authoritarian personality, probably caused by over-strict fathers, at least that's what you need to know, who are obsessed with authority. They went all the way in the milligram study, blindly obedient. It can be measured on the F scale, and that is the dispositional factors. Just to wrap up the topic, what I want to do is help clarify the links between situational and dispositional. So these are the 4 social behaviours that you need to understand. These are the key concepts of the topic. Each of these has 2 explanations, one situational, one dispositional. Pro or antisocial behaviour is caused by your culture from the situational factors and your moral development from disposition. Conformity, majority influence or self-esteem. Obedience, authority figures or authoritarian personality. And whether you go with a crowd or collective behaviour is de-individuation, or, conveniently hidden by my face, is it your locus of control? That was a test of my memory there. So that is everything that you need to know, all the theories and all the studies. I will post one more video that sums up the applications section, hopefully fairly soon, but that's all the content you need about social influence.